Hello, Gershom Gorenberg.
Hello, Glenn Loury. How are you?
I'm fine. Really good to be talking with you. Welcome to Blogging Heads, or back to Blogging Heads, and to the Glenn Show. Excited about talking with you today about your book, The Unmaking of Israel, which I've had the pleasure recently of spending some time with. So, you're doing well. Are you in Jerusalem?
I am talking to you from my home in Jerusalem. And you're in?
I am in Brookline, Massachusetts. Sunny Brookline, Massachusetts, I'm happy to say.
Great. Okay.
Yeah. So maybe we should just begin with you giving us some idea of what you're doing in this book, The Unmaking of Israel.
Well, basically what I'm talking about is trends, policies in Israel based on short-sighted decisions, refusals to make decisions, policies that people didn't think out, that are having the effect of undermining Israel's democracy and its very existence as a state, and what needs to be done about that to turn Israel around and essentially reestablish Israel as a state and as a democracy. And the central themes I'm dealing with here are the aftermath of the 1967 conquest of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and Israel's settlement of those territories and refusal to come to terms with the consequences of that for Israel itself, and the consequences of the connection of religion and state, or as one would say in Israel, of synagogue and state. My goal here is to go through Israeli history and show how these things have developed, and also be making an argument about Israel's future. And in terms of doing that, to make an argument about the consequences of the continuing occupation in particular that is a little bit different than what people normally hear both in Israel and abroad. The normal argument either focuses on the consequences of the occupation on the Palestinians, which I agree is very important, or speaks in terms of a trade-off for Israel, of Israel would have to make sacrifice of giving up land for peace. And my argument is that this ongoing situation is destructive to Israel itself, and for Israel's own self-interest. It needs a fairly drastic change in direction.
I see. Now, on reading your book, one of the things that struck me most strong was the opposition that you create between the ethos of movement and the role that the settling of the land played, the almost mystical role that the activity of settling the land played in the ideology of labor Zionism. This movement, on the one hand, and the imperatives of the construction of a democratic state on the other. I understand you to be saying that those two aspects of Israeli and Jewish history are in conflict with one another. Do I understand that correctly? And could you expand on that, if so?
Yes. First of all, you do understand correctly. And second of all, I would put this in a wider frame. I think that the biggest crisis for a revolutionary movement is when it wins, because then it has to transform itself. People have to become something else. They have to stop being revolutionaries and become what you might call institutionaries.
From revolutionaries to institutionaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Zionism began as a movement for Jews defined as a national group to achieve independence, to achieve self-determination. Settlement of the land, originally conceived of as rural settlement, usually socialist rural settlement, creating kibbutzim and cooperative farming villages, was a means toward that end, and it was a means that was very significant in the success of this movement in creating a state in 1948. The problem, and this is certainly not just an Israeli problem in the wider sense, is that once you create a state, you have to change your consciousness. You're no longer rebelling against somebody. You're building institutions. Means that might have been helpful beforehand can become obsolete. Parties whose whole program was creating a state, have to redefine themselves. So I want to underline here that in terms of countries that became independent after World War II, in a lot of ways, Israel made this transition more successfully than others. It created a parliamentary democracy.
Sure.
We've never had a coup. Even the best runner-up in continuous democracy, India, had a government-declared state of emergency in which the democratic system was basically called off for a couple of years. Israel has not had any of those crises of democratic rule. However, in the wake of Israel's conquest of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan, and at the time the Sinai Peninsula as well in 1967, a lot of Israel's leaders, it was only 19 years after they created the state. They created the state as young people. Most of the same people were still in charge. And without thinking through seriously the consequences, they reverted to their behavior in pre-state days. In particular, they started using the creation of Jewish settlements in the occupied territory as a way of, they saw it, of setting Israel's borders for the future. But what had been a useful and, I would say, legitimate means for a movement turned out to have extremely destructive effects for a state. And we can see those effects today.
Okay, again, let me just make sure I'm understanding. So, pre-1948, settlement of the land, settlement in relatively remote areas, strategic settlement aimed at both defense and at sort of laying a claim, creating facts that would later be negotiated into formal borders was one thing. But post-1967, the same kind of ideologically oriented settlement activity was something else altogether, and not nearly as constructive as the ethos of settlement had been prior to 1948. Is that correct?
That's right. And part of what's going on here is that pre-48, in British-ruled mandatory Palestine, you had a classic situation, a situation that's existed in other parts of the world of two national groups living in the same territory, overlapping, conflict between them, each of them wanting self-determination, each of them thinking ideally self-determination in all of that territory. The United Nations proposed solution to that problem in the partition decision of 1947 was to say, okay, neither of you is going to get the whole loaf, you'll each get half a loaf. We're going to divide this territory into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And even though the UN did not do anything to carry out that decision, and the final borders at the end of partition, as established by the 1949 armistice between Israel and its Arab neighbors, was the result of a war and not of the lines that the UN had set down. But essentially, what happened is that Jewish sovereignty was established in part of what had been mandatory Palestine. And from then on, you had a state, and the state negotiated its borders in the armistice agreement, defended its borders with the state's military, needed to establish the rule of law, which is to say laws that applied to everybody, was not terribly successful in this, but worked slowly toward creating an equality between those citizens who were Jews and those who were not Jews. Now the movement was not just responsible for its own nationality, but for everybody living in the country. What happened after 1967 was that same methodology, that same approach of we're involved in an ethnic conflict over the whole land, was suddenly revived, except that in the ethnic conflict in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in particular, you had two sides struggling against each other, Jews and Palestinians, except one side had the state on its side, providing its power. But besides that, when the state used the method of settlement in the occupied territories, it did several things to itself. First of all, state officials and activists regularly broke both local law and international law. So they were acting not like people who were responsible for a state, who were responsible for the rule of law, but like members of a movement. In the process, they were destroying the rule of law in Israel. They created a situation where Israelis living in the West Bank and formerly in the Gaza Strip have the rights of Israeli citizens, whereas Palestinians living in those areas live under a mix of military law and today the Autonomous Palestinian Authority at a much different status, not enjoying the right to vote in Israel, which is the ruling power. And in other words, this undermines democracy and equality. Part of the people who are governed have no voice in the polity that is governing them, the state of Israel. In each of these ways, this is taking apart the state rather than building it.
Okay. Let's come to the dismantling thing. But I have a thought that I would like to get your reaction to, a kind of visceral, sort of instinctual thought here, which is that once you get into the business of an ethnic state, I don't say that it's unprecedented, and I don't say it's without historic warrant, but the thought is, once we're in that business, once we're in the business of a state, which is a civil authority, a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a well-defined territory, on the one hand, and an ethnos, which is a community, a continuous community across generations, informed by cultural and ideological and religious convention and belief. Once we get into that business, we're susceptible to this kind of corruption. I mean, the story that you tell in the book is a particular story based on the history of the aftermath of the 1967 war, but it strikes me that this danger will always be there as long as one is defining, combining the project of state construction and state building on the one hand and the aspirations of an ethnic community on the other. The U.S. Constitution, for example, I think is quite explicit in making sure that doesn't happen here on arguments about the implications for democracy and for the rights of individuals of that kind of development. So I've talked enough, but I think you see my point. I mean, you're making the point that the corruption of a kind of ultra-Orthodox religious, the separation of synagogue and state, which is not enforced in your country. But I'm thinking that it's the ethnos state separation that might even be a prior necessary move. And I wonder how you react to that.
Well, let me react in two pieces to this. One is, when you talk in terms of the United States Constitution today, you would be right. Obviously, when you talk in terms of the United States historically, the situation is the exact opposite, because the United States was created as a state
for white people. I got it.
For the cards on the table for white people, right? And in fact, even in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court of the United States said that black people could not be citizens of the United States. So you're talking from the experience of
go on.
Experience of 200 plus years of working on this project, and we're more junior members of the league. But the other thing is that the United States is, even in the Western world, the outlier on this. In other words, self-determination of ethnic groups, nation states is for instance, across Europe, that's the normal situation. The idea of a Jewish state is no more radical in terms of present-day political realities than a Czech state or a French state or any of those others. The question is, though, and I think this is a very important question, is what is the relationship of the ethnos to the state? What does that mean? Is it that the state functions purely to serve the ethnos and that nothing else is important? Or is that one characteristic which has to be balanced against others? And here I'm going to quote from the Israeli legal and political thinker Chaim Gantz, who says that one conception of ethnic nationalism is a liberal conception, and in that conception, what nationalism says is a part of each individual's identity is that he or she belongs to a culture, a group, and wants to see that identity expressed not only in their home but in the public square, And self-determination is a way of doing that. So it begins with the individual right of wanting to express one's culture in a public way. But like all other individual rights, they have to be balanced against each other. And that's something that goes on with all sorts of rights in a democratic society at all the time. I mean, in other words, I pick up the newspaper and I read about arguments in Western countries about balancing religious freedom against women's equality, for instance. I've never heard anything about that. But,
oh, no, not over here.
Not over there, right? You have to balance freedom of the press against security concerns. You have to balance personal security against personal dignity every time you go through an airport, right? So courts and legislators and executives in every democratic country are constantly involved in the balance, in adjudicating the balance, the proper balance between different sets of individual rights. So I think it's legitimate for Israel to express Jewish self-determination in the sense that if there's a large Jewish majority, it's natural that the language used most commonly is the Jewish language, or that state offices are closed on Jewish holidays for the simple reason that most people wouldn't show up anyway. Or even, to give you an example which seems religious but I think is actually one of individual rights, it's legitimate for the army of the Jewish state to keep kosher kitchens in its mess halls because over 50% of the soldiers want kosher food. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're Orthodox Jews or they're observant in other ways, but many, many Israelis who aren't religious in other ways eat kosher. So their right to participate in public life is protected by that arrangement. On the other hand, it's not legitimate for the state to discriminate in allocating jobs or funding or classrooms or land use in favor of the ethnic majority against the ethnic minority. And those have been issues which continue to be fought out in Israel. Again, I don't think Israel is unusual in this sense. I think that, for instance, if you look at the fight about headscarves in France, there is a fight going on between what's seen as a secular, but is in very many ways a post-Christian European conception of what it means to be French versus rights of religious freedom and whether or not Frenchness can be inclusive in a wider way. Our particular variation on that is that even within the pre-67 borders of Israel, you would have to adjudicate that, and I think that you need some very significant changes to achieve a better balance. I think that the business of doing that is made much more difficult by ruling the occupied territories.
But I want to ask you just on this basic question about state and ethnos. So, if I understand you,
These
say
are great questions.
there's nothing historically unprecedented about that, and handled properly, it can be perfectly consistent with democracy. Now, the observation I want to make is that how that's handled, that is, how the rules and the boundaries that govern the relationship between state power on the one hand and ethnic aspiration on the other, how that's managed, that's getting decided on a day-to-day basis through the institutions of the state in question. And to the extent that they are not pluralistic, these institutions, in the case at hand, I mean, to the extent that Arabs are not playing a role in the political life, a determinative role or an influential role, one might expect things could get more likely, off the tracks, that balance might not be as rightly struck. And that leads me to ask the question whether or not, if there were a more robust Arab minority with a voice in contemporary Israeli politics, if the Zionist project, as you understand it, would be more secure, even if the Jewish majority would be less secure in such a polity. I don't know, is that question coherent?
Okay, so let me try to respond to that on a couple levels. First of all, the state of Israel within the pre-67 borders has an Arab minority that is approximately 1/6 of the population. That minority has the right to vote. There are political parties in Israel's multi-party system who draw their votes mainly from the Arab minority. And I think that they also have a cultural effect on the country. I think that that even when the Jewish majority doesn't realize it, it's in many ways affected by its culture is changed by the fact that there's a significant and active minority in the country. There's a problem, however, and this is a very real problem, that first of all, that the state has sometimes acted as if its interests and those of the Jewish majority are the same. I don't think that that's true. I think that the state has to protect the rights of all citizens. And second of all, that as long as Israel is in a state of war with an unresolved conflict with the Palestinians, that the Arab minority within Israel, which considers itself Palestinian, is in a very, very difficult position. It becomes easier for the Israeli right, not justified, but easier to, in various ways, to delegitimize Arab participation in political life. And the most telling example of that is that there's an unwritten law in Israeli politics that the Arab-backed parties are never part of the ruling coalition. The only prime minister who half broke that rule was the late Yitzhak Rabin. But you have a situation in which there are Knesset members of parliament, who clearly represent the Arab minority, but informally, de facto, their power is restricted by this rule, which is always based upon the conflict and security concerns and so forth.
Well, I'm asking you whether you think that the concerns that you have about the unmaking, the corruption of the Israeli democratic project mightn't be as severe if there were a more robust participation of Arabs in Israeli governance, for example, as members of governing coalition. They'd have more power in the short run, but the balance of decision making on the matters that are of greatest concern to you might go in a direction that you would favor. I'm asking.
Well, I think, first of all, I would like to see a situation in which that de facto disqualification didn't exist. I think that the Arab minority should be able to be part of governing institutions. But I have to turn around the forces, the cause and effect that you're suggesting. What I'm saying is that it is, even though the Arab minority members of the Arab minority would and do say that their greatest interest is resolving the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, they have difficulty expressing that politically as long as the conflict goes on. In fact, one of the reasons that they're so interested in that resolution is because they correctly see the situation of conflict as the thing that's creating the political bar to their participation. In a post-peace situation, in a situation where there was a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians, I think that the political pathway for greater Arab participation in the state would be much wider. It would be much easier for them to do that, because they would no longer be seen by parts of the majority as belonging to the other side in the conflict. Again, I'm talking about somebody else's viewpoint here, but one that I have to describe in a repertorial way in order to explain what's going on here. Not in the sense that I'm justifying that exclusion.
Understood. Okay, so let's talk about how, in your view, the occupation is really corrupting the state-building and democracy-seeking project in Israel.
Okay, well, look, you mentioned before Max Weber's definition of the state as having the monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a given territory.
Right.
So let me just mention two aspects of that, and then that's his definition of a state, but I would also add that it's very important to the definition specifically of a democratic state, because in a democratic state, the territorial lines determine who are the governed, and everybody who is among the governed is supposed to have a role in determining who the government is. So it's hard to tell who the governed are unless you have clear borders. So first of all, immediately following 1967, this was a symbolic move, but it was a very significant one. In October of 1967, 4.5 months after the Six-Day War, 4.5 months after Israel's conquest of the West Bank, a government minister gave the instructions to remove the pre-war borders from Israel's maps. So the border between Israel and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip has not since then appeared on Israeli maps. It still exists legally in the sense that up to those borders Israeli law applies and beyond the military law applies. But I think that I could probably put you in a room with a piece of paper and you could draw a rough map of the United States. Most Israeli college students can't draw a map of Israel according to the legal pre-67 borders of the state. So the defined territory was symbolically blurred by that. The creation of settlements in the occupied territory and the giving of the status of Israeli residents to those who were living in those settlements physically blurred the lines, because you have Israelis living in places in the West Bank who vote in Israeli elections and who are judged before Israeli courts and couldn't even serve in the Israeli parliament or Supreme Court. So where exactly is the border of the state? Once you've blurred that, you've taken away a basic element of statehood. If you have a
let me just ask you one thing. That's not an accident, right? I mean, the border is not clearly delineated in the education of young people or in the daily practice by choice. But that's a reflection of a widespread sentiment that the borders of the state ought to be more expansive than they would otherwise have been. Or am I wrong?
You're right. What happened was that the government's position, and particularly the position of the first politician who made this change in 1967, was that the pre-war boundaries were armistice lines, therefore they were temporary lines, and the permanent lines would be determined at some other point by either by unilateral Israeli moves or by negotiation with the Arab states. But by erasing those lines before any diplomatic change, what happened is you have a state with no clear boundaries. You said it's all up in the air, it's for the future. Except at the moment, an Israeli, seventh grader is staring at the map on the bulletin board while he's spacing out during class, sees a map that says Israel on it, except that Hebron, which is in the West Bank, and Tel Aviv and Israel are all within the same borders. And then when some politician comes along and says, we have to give up Hebron for peace, it's like you're talking about giving up part of my country. Yes, I think that the politicians who made that change had an interest in that, and I think that when more recently there have been politicians who wanted to put that line back on the map and back in the textbooks and they've met resistance, it's because there's people who want to be able to change those borders.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, you were explaining about the corrupting role of the occupation in undermining the rule of law, for example.
So undermining the rule of law. So here's several layers of that. First of all, from the first settlement onward, the first settlement was established in the Golan Heights in July of 1967. There's been a repeated pattern of government officials breaking the law in order to help settlement. The first settlement in the Golan got funding from a government ministry on a fraudulent basis. When the first settlement was established in the West Bank in September of 1967, it was done by a government decision, even though the Prime Minister and other top ministers had received the legal opinion of the legal advisor of the Foreign Ministry, which said that under international law, including the Geneva Convention, which Israel had signed, it's illegal to settle your citizens in occupied territory. There have been, over the years, consistent report that Israel has failed to enforce the law when it is violated by West Bank settlers. So in each of these ways, the rule of law is being eroded. And then I'll give you one more example of this, which I think is particularly significant, which is well, actually two sides of this. One is the Israeli government subsidizes the settlement, provides economic incentives for Israelis to move to the settlements, but there is no accounting of those subsidies. Nobody in the Israeli government itself knows how much Israel is spending on that, because it's so woven into the rest of the budget that it would be a massive project to unravel it. And that removes a basic requirement for, something really technical but really important for a democratic debate, which is how much does it cost? I mean, imagine that you're having an argument about healthcare or schools or anything else, and both sides are arguing without any price tag on it. It becomes almost
the
absurd.
analogy that I think of is the intelligence agencies' budgets here in the United States, which are somewhat non-transparent by design, in order to protect the secrecy of the enterprises that they're engaged in. It's hard to get line item itemization of being spent by the CIA, but that's by design. Is what you're talking about also by design, hiding the spending so that one can't backtrack and figure out what the actual de facto policy is?
Well, it's a combination of accretion and not wanting to do anything about it. In other words, what happened was that before 67 even, Israel had certain mechanisms in place to create incentives to move to certain parts of the country. The government wanted to get people to move to outlying areas rather than everybody in Israel living in Tel Aviv. And some of the outlying towns were poor and had a low socioeconomic and low educational profile. So, for instance, they created an incentive which said that if a teacher moved to one of these poor outlying towns, that she or he would get certain salary benefits. So when they wanted to incentivize the settlements, they just applied the same incentive to the settlements. So, strangely enough, if you live in a settlement, even if you teach within Israel, and you're a teacher, you get paid more than a teacher with the same seniority and education who lives in Tel Aviv. But the price tag of that is under one line of the budget, which is for the incentives, and isn't broken down geographically. Now, somebody could do that. I think that the government officials who did that were perfectly happy with that effect, but and may have even used this extension of existing incentives in order to certainly used the method of extending existing incentives as a way of reducing debate, because that was easier to do as a bureaucratic rather than as a public policy decision. Right? You just, you have this list, and the ministry is allowed to put down on the list which towns qualify, and so you change the list. It's much less transparent. But one of the results is that the Israeli public doesn't know what it's paying for this enterprise, and that I think is not very democratic.
You give examples in the book of Israeli citizens who are settlers in the occupied territories perpetrating violence against Palestinians, as I read it, almost with impunity, because the military occupying authorities would not enforce adequately laws against such perpetrators for ideological reasons. That seems appalling to me. Is that a widespread phenomenon, and what is the reaction amongst more centrist, politically centrist Israelis to that practice in the occupied territories? It's
a reality. The first major government report I know of on this subject is from 1982, so this isn't a new problem. I've seen reports on incidents much more recently. Part of the problem here is that it is, I think, built into the structure of the occupation, because the military is responsible for the military. In a military occupation, the military is essentially the sovereign. The military is responsible for the functions of government. And yet, once you have Israelis settling in the occupied territory, the military sees itself as the protector of the Israelis there. And it's on one side. It's not an objective governing force. It's not maintaining order between everybody who lives there. And this has resulted in ongoing problems of settler violence against Palestinians. There are Israeli human rights groups who have reported on this, and I think have brought a lot of this to the attention of the Israeli public. I don't think it's had sufficient political impact. And yet, I would also say here, and this is something I want to say to put this together, these are issues which are discussed and debated within the Israeli political context. What I'm saying to you here is not something from a radical perspective. I'm talking about issues which are in the Israeli press every day. And I think it's important to understand what the implications of what I'm saying are. The implications are that the occupation is bad for Israel itself, that supporting a two-state solution, supporting an end to the occupation, an end to the settlement enterprise, is supporting Israel's democracy, Israel's political stability, Israel's long-term survival as a country. That's a pro-Israel position.
Yeah, well, if Obama adopts that position, he will be an anti-Israel president on the tenor of American politics, as I understand it.
That is something which, for any Israeli visiting the United States, makes it a little bit like visiting Mars. It's absolutely bizarre to hear, for instance, Republican presidential candidates taking positions which either dropped out of Israeli discourse 30 years ago or would put them far to the right of Netanyahu. I mean, I've heard the word slung around that they're acting like Likudniks, like members of Netanyahu's Likud party. And I am no fan of Netanyahu's Likud party.
Yeah, but it's much worse than that.
But I think it's terribly unfair to Netanyahu to say that Gingrich or Santorum is acting like a Likudnik, because the positions that they have evinced are actually way to the right, in Israeli terms, of the Likud. The Republican candidates have placed themselves somewhere out on the tin hat radical right of Israeli politics. Okay. And that's being described as a pro-Israel position. It sort of blows my mind.
Well, I'll get into trouble perhaps for saying so, but it strikes me that once again we've got a situation where the ethnos and the kind of the civic imperatives are in conflict with one another. I mean, the American Jewish community and the American Christian Zionist community, I mustn't neglect to say, influence the tenor of American discussion about problems in Israel, issues in Israel, in such a way that you get what you get from the Republican candidates who are pandering to a part of the electorate. But if it's bad for Israel, it's probably also bad for the United States.
Yeah, in fact, this is, I certainly am not one of those people who think that Israeli interests and American interests always line up. And in my historical research, one of the really fascinating days was the day in the Johnson Library in Austin, Texas, where I found McGeorge Bundy's memo from the summer of 1967, sort of laying out the points of where Israeli interests lined up and didn't line up with American interests and how that would affect American policy, because the Bundy memo in some ways lays out everything that's gone on in American-Israeli relations since then. So it doesn't always line up. But on the issue of a two-state solution, yeah, American and Israeli interests line up on the fact that it's good for Israel to reach an end to the conflict, and it's good for America not to have to reduce the amount of conflict roiling the Middle East. So I think that those politicians, who are playing to this far-right position in Israeli terms, are not doing anybody any good. I think you can correct me if you think I'm wrong about this. I think that in a lot of ways, in terms of votes, they're playing more to the Christian Zionist right, because
sure.
I don't think that candidate Santorum or candidate Gingrich, if either one of them were to become the nominees of the Republican Party is going to do real well in the Jewish vote. I'm scared to make predictions. It's a bad thing for a journalist to make a prediction, particularly one that can be disproven in the relatively short run. I think that it's a safe bet.
That looks pretty safe.
Rick Santorum as a candidate is going to do wonders for the political unity of the American Jewish community.
No, if you're counting, if you're counting votes, you're certainly right. If you were counting dollars, I wouldn't necessarily have the same view. And if you were counting sort of concentrated influence at particular important nodes of decision making in the U.S. government, again, I think the American Israel Public Affairs Committee is a very effective lobby, and they do exert influence on the government's behavior.
Yes.
But certainly, if you're talking about electoral impact, I agree with you. It's not going to be the Jewish vote that's swinging Republican with these guys pandering.
Right.
But you should.
Right.
I want you to talk a little bit about this other aspect of your argument, which is the role that ultra-Orthodoxy is playing, and the economy and the social organization, as well as in the sort of political tenor of Israeli society, and your concerns about the failure for there to be a separation between synagogue and state, as you put it.
Okay. First of all, just as a general thing, as I said before, the idea of a Jewish state is not parallel to an Islamic republic. It's parallel to a Czech republic. It doesn't mean that there has to be theocracy here. And in terms of Judaism, and I'm saying this as somebody who's an Orthodox Jew, I think that religion thrives and does better when not connected to state institutions. That the moment that you put clerics on the state payroll, you warp the character of religion. The moment that a state agency determines what religious education is going to look like, you run the risks of severely warping the religion. I'm not necessarily a free marketeer about a lot of things, but in terms of religion, it's best for the government to stay out of that and leave it to the choice of citizens. In the Israeli situation, for complex historical reasons, which I explain in the book, coalitions have been created since the beginning of the state between mainly secular parties and parties representing a variety of different religious viewpoints. One of those religious viewpoints is the viewpoint of the ultra-Orthodox. This is a community which claims to be old-time Judaism, but in fact practices a form of Judaism which is much more self-segregating, much more cutting itself off from the wider world, and much more strict in its interpretation of Jewish law than Judaism traditionally was in the past. One of the ways that it has done that with the somewhat bizarre support of the state is that a situation has developed in which most ultra-Orthodox men never go to work. They spend their whole lives in religious studies, and on the one hand, the state subsidizes that, and on the other hand, the ultra-Orthodox community is is impoverished and is right now facing really an economic crisis.
How many people are we talking about? Excuse me. How large a community is this?
Well, that's difficult to say because it's not something that the census asks, and so there's all sorts of debates, among demographers about exactly how many, what portion of Israel's population is ultra-Orthodox. But the low estimates, which define the term very strictly, begin at somewhere around 7%, and it goes up from there. But when you have that, that's you could say, well, that's not a huge minority, but when no man from that community is, or only two-thirds, I'm sorry, let me rephrase this, when only one-third of the men from that community are regularly holding jobs, it's a big problem. To add to that, many of those jobs are in state-supported religious institutions, either in the state-controlled rabbinate or in education. And that brings you to two more problems. The state-controlled rabbinate has the power of marriage, controls marriage and divorce for Jewish citizens in the state of Israel. So you have people with a very extreme interpretation of religion controlling through that interpretation, controlling marriage and divorce, which is an affront to the civil rights of everybody else in the state, and I would say including other people who are religious but don't have that interpretation of religion. Secondly, the form of education that the state is supporting for that community is one in which children, and particularly boys, are receiving an education which is almost entirely devoted to religion, to religious study, and it is neither preparing them for gainful employment as adults, certainly not in a high-tech economy, and it is neither is it preparing them for that, nor is it preparing them to be thinking independent, autonomous members of a democratic society. So in both the economic and the democratic sense, that's a situation which is very threatening to the country's future. And again, this is a subject which is of major debate within Israeli society, but I think much more needs to be done in this area.
So you've identified a host of problems. I'm wondering how you can be optimistic about the future.
Well, I'll say a couple things about that. First of all, I think that pessimism is a luxury. It's a luxury particularly for people who are at a distance or for whom the current situation doesn't affect directly. I think that that pessimism isn't realism. It's an unrealistic attitude that things can't change. And it's easier to take that attitude when the situation doesn't touch you directly. So I just don't think I have that luxury. I have to try to bring these situations to people's attention, argue for change. And the second thing that I can say is I've seen changes take place here. I moved to Israel in September of 1977. At the time I came, if you had told most people on the street that we would reach peace with Egypt, they would have told you that that was impossible. And yet, several months later, the president of Egypt was standing before the Israeli parliament declaring his desire for a peace agreement. And in less than 2 years, we reached such a peace agreement. So I think changes can take place. I've seen changes take place. I've seen a change take place in Israeli society from a situation that existed 25 years ago, where if you said that you were in favor of a two-state solution, you placed yourself on the radical fringes of Israeli society, to a situation where that's a centrist position today. I'm extremely concerned about the situation today, and I think that politics is the business of change and that it can take place.
So what are the things going on the ground now that are a reflection of this process of change that you're hopeful for?
Well, I will admit the situation under the current government is particularly negative. We have a very hardline right-wing government under Netanyahu. In part, that's a product of the fact that former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert was resigned amid numerous corruption allegations, something which damaged the center and left in the next elections. As I said, in the widest sense, the possibility of talking about a two-state solution in the Israeli public today is greater than it was in the past. In this moment sense of the current government, I am discouraged by its policies, by its unwillingness to engage in a meaningful peace process, and I can only hope that in the next elections we manage to elect a government which is more interested in peace and more interested in democracy.
Gershom, do you think that the displaced Arabs after the conflict in 48 who wanted to return immediately after the conflict ended to their homes should have been allowed to return?
I think that at that moment Israel faced a very, very serious problem, which was that had there simply been a direct return without any sort of peace agreement after the intense communal conflict that had taken place, it's hard to imagine how how any sort of functioning, peaceful polity could have been created. However, I also think that the Israeli government at the time was very happy to have that situation and to put that off to the future. I'd prefer to talk about the problem in terms of the present day. Sure. I don't think that a return of the refugees en masse today is a realistic program. I do think that as part of a peace process, Israel is almost certainly going to have to agree to some small-scale symbolic return, and I think that the majority of the refugee problem is going to have to be solved in terms of refugees going to a sovereign Palestinian state in what's today the West Bank and Gaza.
Understood. Let me ask you one last question. It's about Iran and the clamoring for war. What is, in your sense, your reading, what's the state of sentiment about that in the Israeli population? I hear the government pronouncements, but I'm wondering what people on the street are thinking and saying about that.
Look, it's a subject here. The fact of the matter is I read more pronouncements about how war is almost upon us in the American media than I do in the Israeli media. And I read all of those pronouncements with the question of who's leaking this information and what are they trying to achieve by doing so. And the pronouncement being true or the prediction being true, truth is fairly low on the list of reasons why somebody might make a leak like that. I think that there is a desire to frighten Iran. On the other hand, I think that a lot of the talk that's going on is because the American administration is very concerned that Israel might attack and the effects on the region and is trying to make its opinion very clear. In terms of on-the-ground sort of preparations, the kind of home front preparations that I saw, for instance, before the 1991 Gulf War, or even before the 2003 invasion of Iraq when Israel was afraid of being hit by missiles, there's not a sense of, like, we're all getting ready for there to be a war tomorrow. There's a lot of discussion of this issue. There's a lot of, public debate about what it would mean, but you don't have a sense daily that people, or at least that most people, I have some very high-maintenance friends who, respond to every quiver in the wind as if war is about to break out. But, outside of that personality type, the public mood, I don't think, is one that war is about to break out any second. We could be wrong. As I said, there's, being surprised is part of living here. I talked about being surprised by peace moves before. I will also tell you that the situations when I've been here and I've lived through war have also not been ones that you knew it was coming for months and months beforehand. Yeah. So, which is sort of a reason not to let yourself be, swept away by every news report either.
How has your book been received now that it's been out for a while?
I think overall very positively. From a wide range of people. I've received the expected criticisms from people who identify with the Israeli right. I've received certain expected criticisms from people with a hardline Palestinian position who were not happy with parts of my description of Israeli history. When I received those criticisms, I said, okay, that's, I was expecting that. Overall, I'm pleased.
Good. Well, overall, I'm very pleased I've had the opportunity to talk with you, Gershom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Glenn.
We'll sign off and talk again, perhaps, on another occasion.